Hello, everyone. I'm Amy of the Architecture Foundation, and welcome to the 2023 Book Week. Today we have Edwin Heathcote in conversation with Tom Emerson to talk about Edwin's new book, On the Street in Between Architecture. And now I'll pass over to Edwin and Tom, who will begin the conversation. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, Amy. Hi, Eddie. Very nice to be chatting to you about your book. I think we should probably say in full disclosure that we've known each other for a very long time, so we sort of know quite a lot about what makes us tick and what and there's lots of ground that we share.
Yeah.
But now today we're coming for a chat about On the Street, the book that you produced last year. And I just wanted to maybe, just as a first question, just to ask what motivated the book, or what's it about, and why did you do
it? It's been a kind of long, not exactly an obsession, but a kind of sideline that I've been, I suppose I don't really have a hobby, but if I have a hobby, it's wandering around cities slightly aimlessly that I don't know necessarily, and then maybe just snapping things that take my fancy. And the more I wandered, the more I noticed the particular armature of kind of public life, these bits and pieces, the bollards, the phone boxes, the kiosks, and the differences between the cities. But also, I'm very fond of looking at old photographs of cities. I'm very fond of looking at photos from the 1890s or the 1920s, and the big famous photographers, Helen Levitt and Andre Curtis, Brushay, Gary Winogrand, and so on. And I noticed that they used street furniture a lot in their photographs. It's almost as if if you have there's a kind of parallel population to the city of these inanimate objects. There are people, but there are also these objects, and it just seemed to me a kind of slightly neglected field in architecture.
Great. That leads on to really maybe my first specific question, which relates to when I went to buy the book. I bought it in the bookshop in London. This is the book. Beautiful book. It's a very nice object, and we'll talk about the book itself in a moment. And I went to the architecture section and I couldn't find it. And then I went to ask for the sales assistant if they had it. They looked it up and they said, yes, they had 3 copies. And they couldn't find it.
Yeah.
We looked in industrial design,
right,
furniture design.
Mm-hmm.
Eventually, they found it in photography.
Right.
And I was just wondering what kind of category of subject or discipline or book you kind of conceive the thing as.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I suppose it would be in a way a more natural question to ask in, say, France. So in France, there is this sort of cultural history section of Roland Barthes and this kind of exploration of, for want of a better word, the everyday, the kind of philosophical implications of the ordinary. But somehow here, it's much more heavily taxonomized. And I'm quite happy, actually, with it being photography. That doesn't bother me. But I've also had people saying they found it in furniture. The furniture section is street furniture. And, people who can't find it at all, which is the majority. I put architecture in the subtitle at the behest of my publisher because they said, well, you want architecture in there somewhere because it has to be made, it's an architecture book. But in a way, it's not a conventional architecture book. It's much more personal than that. But of course, that from a publishing point of view, that's totally hopeless. So it's difficult to find. Maybe there's a kind of increased pleasure when you actually do find it. That's all I can think of.
And well, that's interesting that you reference how the French might do it, because it seems to be a book that's very leaning into primarily European, big European cities, and cities that developed or expanded massively in the 19th century.
Yeah.
So is there something, maybe this was a question I was going to ask a bit later, but your book sort of covers kind of pre-modern, early modern.
Yeah.
I would say maybe a little bit less of the contemporary, except
Yeah.
towards the end, but we'll come on to that.
Yeah.
Is this a particular period, or is there a particular time in the making of cities that you would consider to be the most productive?
Yeah, absolutely. Probably most of the book is about London, actually, but the most productive period is without doubt is Paris in the 1860s. And there is a chapter there on a photographer called Charles Malvieux, who was commissioned by the city of Paris. In fact, he became the kind of city of Paris's official photographer. And he was commissioned to first document the destruction of the old Paris, and then the building of the Grand Boulevard of the kind of Haussmann plan. And a big part of the Haussmann plan was a system of street furniture, kind of industrialized and standardized system of street furniture. You know, the pissoir, the newsstands, the colonne Morris, you know, the cylindrical advertising columns, the Wallace fountains with the three kind of graces. And he photographed those almost as portraits. So once the first ones had been installed in the new city, he took effectively portraits of them in the city. It was rather strange, almost like as if they were sitting for a photo. And then those photographs became ambassadors for the city. So they were exhibited in kind of expos and world's fairs around the world as kind of illustrations of Paris as the ideal modern city, you know, with all these utilities kind of integrated aesthetically, unified in a way, all painted in the same kind of dark green, you know, very much a kind of urban branding project. So yeah, I think that's got to be the highlight. But if you don't mind me talking even more about that, there's also an illustration from the Macfarlane's catalogue, which is a big Glasgow foundry from the 1880s, which shows a kind of cross-section of city, and highlighted in it, that's it, actually, right there, amazing. Highlighted in it are all of the fittings that you could buy from Macfarlane's, you know, and there are lampposts and horse troughs and WCs, railings, whole shop fronts, and they could just be as easily be, you know, sent to London from Glasgow as Cape Town or Melbourne or you know, Bombay. So there's another high point there where this mass manufactured stuff begins to appear across the world's cityscapes. Colonial, you know, obviously it's a colonial enterprise.
It's also very interesting to see that in that image, they've obviously highlighted all the objects, the lights, fountains, and so on, but also all the metalwork, the decorative metalwork.
Yeah.
So it's obviously tying into a kind of an architectural moment.
Yeah, exactly.
Balconies, shop fronts, and so on are also then somehow part of this kind of equipment or accessorizing of the city.
Well, there was this, you know, there was the expansion of the cities that you mentioned, the kind of extreme expansion of the cities, but there was also this incredible colonial expansion where they had to build in no time at all cities in the desert or in the veldt or in, you know, and they had to make these kind of instant cities, and they effectively just imported all the parts, you know, like kits of parts. And the kind of, interestingly, a lot of it doesn't survive, but the lampposts and the street furniture often does survive.
And in terms of that kind of material culture and its kind of exporting and its kind of colonial actions, it seems like metalwork is very much central to the collection of things in the book. And I guess that must be related to coal, and coal, metalwork, railways.
Yeah.
Do you think that this book is sort of somehow tied together by that particular sort of somehow material, a kind of material intensity of that period?
Yeah, very much. Yeah. So I think suddenly labor, so the creation of a sculptural object had to be done by hand until 1750 or something. So there were no extremely ornate lampposts for a candelabra or whatever, because it was just too labor intensive. But once you could sculpt one and then cast 1,000 off it, then suddenly the kind of ornamental becomes the everyday in a way. And that's a big moment for architecture, but for cities as well, is that suddenly the kind of I think we were walking along the embankment one day looking at the lampposts with these sort of fish, incredible fish and serpents and God knows, but by Basil, which is a side effect of Basil Getz remaking of the embankment. And I mean, they're incredible sculptural pieces, a bit kind of garish, but amazing, solid things, only made possible by.
And interestingly, those, I think they're called dolphin lamps. They're not really dolphins. They're sort of mythological dolphins, but they run along the embankment from the 1860s.
That's right.
And then if you actually look at the base of them, the date of casting is on it, and they go right up to the 1930s.
Yeah.
I think even the last one is 1960.
Yeah, that's right. You pointed this out to me, actually.
So it's a kind of amazing that this kind of object somehow finds its place in the city and then just keeps on reproducing itself. Somehow as a kind of marker of new urban space and so on.
Absolutely. Yeah.
The other thing I was really interested in the book itself. So it's partly the things in the book, but the book has a very particular structure. It's like a dictionary.
Yeah.
So the content page is described as a kind of A to Z, or in fact an A to W, of all the elements that make up the city. So advertising, anti-pissing, archiving, ascending, balustrading, barring, booking, bridging. And then it ends with vending, venting, waiting, walling, working.
Yeah.
And this seems to have then, it seems like that there is, apart from the subject that you're looking at, there is also a kind of literary kind of structure, which is somehow seems to be like a kind of preoccupation of the book itself.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think I probably always wanted to be a novelist, but I finally realised I'm probably never going to write a novel. So my interest in literature and literary form needs to be kind of sublimated in an architecture book. It's the only way I can do it. But actually, in a way, the roots are quite prosaic. So I realized that I didn't want this to be a taxonomy, because it's very easy when you're doing this to fall into here are the phone boxes, and this is the history of the phone box, and here are the post boxes, and in 1863 they changed from this pattern to this pattern, and it's not a fantastically engaging way of writing. It's a much more a kind of specialist. In a way, kind of quite nerdy approach. So what I realized was that, for instance, it's better if I use an example rather than just wrap it on. But there's a section there on mourning with a U, which is about how people appropriate street furniture when there is a tragedy. So if a cyclist is run over, or if there's been a stabbing, or a kid has died in a fight, or whatever it might be, you find people stick flowers and photographs to the closest pole, metal pole. And suddenly that piece of street furniture, which might be a pole, it might be a traffic light, zebra crossing, just whatever kind of vertical element there is, that becomes appropriated by the public, and it becomes a much more, so its meaning changes entirely. It becomes a sign of grieving, and there's no way of slipping that into the taxonomy, because the piece of furniture itself is irrelevant. So then I realized that actually it's the verbs, in a way. It's how people use these things that are the thing, whether it's communication or mourning or pissing or whatever it might be. It's the way people use the street furniture that makes it interesting, and that's not necessarily consistent. So cities are designed in one way, but they're used in another,
which kind of gives the book a slightly sort of psychogeographic quality to it. Although it's a book that's ostensibly about things and about design things and manufactured things, it's also much more about somehow finding a way of recording the traces of the traces of use and of people in the city and the things that they deposit. There is one chapter which I like a lot, which is the chapter, there's one called Scraping, which I guess is about feet and mud. And then the next one is about sculpting. And it's almost empty, if you can see that. There's scraping and there is sculpting. It's one line by Robert Musil. And it says, there is nothing in this world, Robert Musil, so invisible as a monument, which is kind of also like almost like the subtext of the book. This is all the stuff that lies out of, they're almost anti-monuments.
Absolutely.
Or alternative monuments. They're not big, they're all small. Probably scaled to the body more than to infrastructure or other things.
And not art.
And not art, yes.
Mostly.
Yes. So the whole book sort of reminds me, it feels like there are a few kind of ancestors to the book in, I would say, you've mentioned in the book several times, and you use a lot of photographs by Richard Wentworth. Who I guess is one sort of the great kind of contemporary chronicler of the city and how it's made, how it breaks, how it's repaired, how it's used, how it's a sort of kind of conversation, ongoing conversation across time and across materials. And I guess that's sort of in there.
Very much. I mean, his approach is one of the formative sort of experiences in the way that led to the book. But those photographs, he has this wonderful series of photos called is it Making Do and Getting By? Getting Do and Making By.
Making Do and Getting By,
Which is, exactly what you say. It's the kind of improvisational use of the city. But there are two recurring motifs in it, which are so rich. One is this kind of idea of creative littering, that people actually don't want to just throw their can or their foam coffee cup in the street, but they do want to get rid of it. So they look for something where they can put it. They look. So, for instance, you often see beer bottles in old foot scrapers. Niches for foot scrapers. You see coffee cups upside down, stuck on a spike of a railing, or squeezed into spaces. You see lots of fag ends squeezed into cracks in the mortar and the wall. And it's all about really how people misappropriate really the things of the city, but then it becomes almost a kind of running gag. It's certainly in Richard's work. It's wonderful. Also lost things, and these lost gloves and lost hats. People stick them they almost impale them on a spike so that they'll be more obvious. People have lost them and come back and retrace their steps.
And I mean, it's also something to do with design and to do with fit. People have a very strong, let's say, almost natural affinity to one thing fitting with another. So it seems like there is a sort of latent design aspect to creative littering. This is this amazing picture by Richard Wentworth of the glove left on the spike of a railing, and somehow they're both black. And so they fit visually. But one is very kind of soft and pliable and to do with the hand, and the other one is sort of slightly violent, spearheaded, and somehow there's the kind of the arrangement is both kind of natural and also kind of disruptive.
And it's so much. It's such a wonderful subversion. So the railing is based on a spear, on a kind of a mythological symbol of a weapon. And the glove is quite a sinister thing as well. The black glove.
The black glove.
You expect someone to be slapped around the face with it, but somehow putting a glove on a spear makes it safe in a way. And it's a lost thing that someone wants someone to be able to find again. So it humanizes the symbolism or the language of that.
I mean, the other person that it reminded me of, particularly in this sort of alphabetical structure, is in two ways, is in the kind of the urban writing of Georges Perec.
Yeah.
One, because he was really into these kind of literary games,
Yeah.
and somehow turning his observations or his stories into kind of riddles and systems and stuff like that. So the alphabetizing of the city into actions rather than things feels very Perecian. But it also feels like, let's say, Perec, the more melancholic side of Perec, which was he was desperately worried about the disappearance of things.
Right.
And I think that really comes from his Jewish ancestry and the fact that many in his family perished in the Second World War. They were Polish Jews, and then he and his parents emigrated to France, and he survived, but his aunts and uncles and so on. And he was really, he became very obsessed by disappearance and leaving traces. And it seems that there is something very kind of quite melancholic about the book. That it seems to be that you are trying to catch things which are disappearing, either literally disappearing or disappearing because we no longer care or we no longer see.
Yeah.
Is that that kind of correct reading?
I think that is probably right. But in a way, as you get older, living in the city becomes a little melancholic, because if you live in one city for a long time, you associate certain places with moments in your life, and then those places disappear. So when you go past that place, you forever remember, that was where I had my first date with such and such, or that was where I went to this concert or that concert or whatever it might be. And those, as they disappear, the city becomes a kind of a site of disappearances. And I think what Perec was also concerned with was the capturing of the fleeting. So there's this lovely project where he tries to document a square in Paris. He tries to document everything that happens in the square. It's kind of just like a kind of monstrous project, but it begins with him, not much is happening. So a couple of buses go by, a few people go by. The next day, the same people go by. Then he begins documenting the flights of the pigeons, when they take off, where they go to, when they reel back, and so on. And then he gives up. And I tried to do something a little bit similar with Clerkenwell Green, where I was just documenting the street furniture, because the whole place was being dug up and it was all changing at the time. And like Perec, I found it almost impossible. You suddenly realize that street furniture is absolutely ubiquitous. The electricity, manhole covers, the sewer covers, the benches, the post boxes, the wires, the poles. It's endless. There are thousands of pieces just in a small plot, bicycle stands, and the railings. I mean,
and in form, it's very like some of Perec stuff, because there's quite a lot of, sort of traditional like riff prose describing things, but then there's a lot of lists. And somehow lists can come in and kind of capture stuff very quickly. And also you read them very quickly. So suddenly there's a change of pace in how the things are recorded. So although you're a lifelong Londoner, aren't you?
Yeah, I am.
Right. So you're a lifelong Londoner, but somehow with quite a lot of almost Parisian method in it. And I think that makes it kind of quite I think one of the things I like about the book, that it's quite it's very playful.
Right. Yeah.
Which I think is a sort of maybe something which one could associate with London quite a bit. As being quite an unruly city. And the city doesn't sort of behave according to laws of urban design. Houseman would not succeed in London.
No, it would never happen. No.
People have had a go, but they always failed.
And that's the kind of counter, I hope, to the melancholy. Is that the underpinning it is a sense that this stuff some of this beautiful infrastructure is disappearing, but what is still there is being appropriated and misused in wonderful ways.
I just wanted to then also mention some of the you've already mentioned Brassai and Richard Wentworth. I was very interested to see a lot of Vivian Maier pictures, because she's quite a different
Yeah.
character within that whole urban photography,
Yeah.
city photography.
Yeah.
So what's your, how did she come into play?
Well, I could have. So I discovered her around 10 years ago or so, maybe a bit more, but I could have easily filled the whole book just with Vivian Maier photos. And she has this fantastic backstory that she was a nanny looking after rich kids and probably neglecting them quite a lot, because she clearly spent most of her time that she was supposed to be looking after them, taking photos. And a lot of them remember that, being waiting around, outside the shop while she was taking photos or whatever. But she saw the city in a different way. I think that, we think of the kind of, like you say, Brachet and Andre Kertész and the kind of grand photographers who take the big, the big kind of classic images of the black and white images of the city. But Maier takes a more fragmented view, I think, and perhaps it's because she's looking at the city partly from the kids' point of view, from the point of view of her charges, that she sees a more intimate level. She looks at a lower datum in the city, and her pictures are just amazing. There's one of a burnt out chair by a trash can in New York, which is, I think it's just one of the most incredible images. There are other fleeting images from buses or of newsstands. There's one of the newsstands.
Yeah, there's one of the newsstand,
Yeah.
which is interesting. The newsstand returns over and over again.
Absolutely.
Eugène Auger,
Yeah.
Vivian Maier, and then I think there's
Look,
Trevor Trainer, and then
yeah.
there's another one with a kid in it.
Yeah, and there's a photo by Stanley Kubrick, actually,
That's
as well,
it,
which
yeah.
is very nice. From when he was working for Look magazines, he started off as a photographer before he became a filmmaker.
FDR is dead.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and it's what's terrific about that photo is the
Stanley Kubrick.
It's a way of documenting the depth of FDR.
And Vivian Maier. And there's another one. I think that's the Auger one. Yes, the fact that they're surrounded by the news of the moment.
Exactly.
So they're like, you don't need a timestamp on it. It's
Exactly. It photographs the news, which is the most fleeting thing.
Yeah.
And I have to tell you a story, because you asked at the beginning how I started writing the book. Well, when I was a late teenager, let's say in my early 20s as well, I used to go around Soho and Tom Ford Road and the gigs and the Astoria and the Marquee Club and stuff. And I would always come home via a newsstand on just by Centrepoint there. And it was the most amazing place, because at about 12:30, they would get the next day's papers. So on a Saturday night, you'd get the Sunday papers, and they were still warm off the press. And I would kind of go there, hand over my cash, get this warm newspaper, and you were kind of living in the future. You were reading tomorrow's news. And I remember thinking that was the kind of essence of the urban experience, and going back on a night bus on the top deck with the kind of steamy, fag smoky interior, with the kind of lights distorted outside, reading tomorrow's news after a good night out. You felt like you were ahead of the weekend, Sunday you wouldn't even have to read the papers.
I remember that distinctly, because when in the 90s, Steph and I lived in, or I used to go and stay with her in Finsbury Park.
Yeah.
And then there was one of those nightstands at King's Cross.
Yeah.
And so you could pick up tomorrow's paper and then take it on the night bus. And then, all of that is, all of that has passed, which is sort of what this thing is kind of.
That's part of the melancholy, but also it was a way of. So I think what was so wonderful about newsstands, and there are still some around, we should support them. But it's a way of reading the city. It's an alternative way. So all these books that we do are about ways in which you read the city. But there, it is a very literal interpretation.
Very literal. Coming sort of slightly further forwards, then there's a nice little chapter. It's a good segue from Vivian Maier. To Milton Keynes, because there was a really fantastic exhibition at MK Gallery, which was done a few years ago, last year. But then there's also a little section about kind of the use of modernizing. Yes, that would be the where a city like Milton Keynes really takes on the idea of furniture, and not just furniture, sort of urban equipment
Yeah,
as kind of a central part of the idea of a city and the social idea of a
yeah,
city.
yeah.
Um,
They just think.
how
There it is.
modernizing? Yeah.
Oh no, I'm sorry, it's wrong. It's not modernizing. Gridding.
Gridding. I thought it was a modernizing.
Sorry.
Yes, it's gridding with the G. Milton Keynes gridding.
Yeah. Well, you were fundamental in this because we walked around together, but you were pointing out some of these things to me, which I then incorporated. So a lot of this is very much about that dialogue when we were wandering from the station to the gallery to see it. But it's a fascinating moment because street furniture really had been a kind of Victorian concern, and it never really. There was no real early modernist or Art Deco street furniture. It didn't really go through those stages. They stuck with the Victorian stuff, which was adequate because it was so kind of overspecified. And then in the 50s, there was an architectural campaign led by the Architectural Review called Outrage.
Yeah, I remember. Yeah,
which was very much
Ian
based.
Nairn and
Exactly, Ian Nairn and the Gordon Cullens drawings, and it was very much based on this idea of an increasingly chaotic townscape. As traffic engineers began to take over the kind of urban function of the city, everything got piled, all these bits of signage and zebra crossings and traffic lights and cables and so on got piled up on top of each other. And then there was a kind of modernist reaction to that, which I think probably finds its zenith in Milton Keynes, where the street furniture is absolutely at the heart of defining the nature of the place. But probably you can talk more about this than I can, the manual and so on.
I suppose, yes. I mean, we got off really deep into the kind of concept, particularly the conception of Milton Keynes rather than the built reality, because it's quite. The built reality of Milton Keynes is patchy, which is probably why it's got a sort of slightly checkered reputation as well. But its peaks are masterful.
Incredible.
In urban design terms, in landscape design terms, in architecture. And I always found that one of the things that Milton Keynes made me realize, even let's say coming back to London, Victorian, like 19th century cities, is that the things that you document in the book, all that stuff, you can almost read the confidence or lack of confidence of a culture.
Yeah.
The way in which a place produces all those things. So the Victorian city and its great casting, kind of elaborate sculpture, you kind of go, okay, this is an extremely confident and wealthy nation, obviously carrying all the kind of colonial, I mean, a huge amount of kind of colonial signification. And then in Milton Keynes, you get curbstones and, particularly things like curbstones, which are huge lumps of Cornish granite.
Yeah.
And there was nothing too good.
Yeah.
During the welfare state, because it's the ultimate welfare state project, there is nothing too good for the public.
Yeah.
And these amazing stainless steel benches and things like that. And you realize that there was this kind of relatively brief moment in the late 60s to early 70s, let's say beyond post-war austerity.
Yeah.
But pre-Thatcherite kind of dismantling of the welfare state, where there was this idea that the state could do good by the public.
Yeah.
And it produced this incredible kind of infrastructure.
Yeah.
And where a bench is totally tied to the grid of the city. So it's like this kind of micro macro idea.
But you pointed out to me, I think that the lampposts, which themselves are these beautiful tapering things with a very simple globe on top, are absolutely always placed at the coming together of 4 stones, at the exact junction of 4 stones.
Always on grid.
And you don't notice that initially when you're walking through, but once you start noticing it, it becomes the most amazing thing. The Romans used to, a milestone was an absolute mark on the map, and it's what made the map conform with the territory. So if you moved a milestone in Rome, you'd be executed. There was no messing about. This was what kind of marked out the extent of the empire and the measurement of land, which is the basis of everything in an empire, obviously. And there's a reflection of that, of the seriousness of that in Milton Keynes. That, you know, that
Absolutely.
these things should be measured and be at specific points, and then they become the kind of tax that allow the city to be built around them.
And then there's the clock,
Yeah,
which is ubiquitous in Milton Keynes as well. So
Yeah.
that's another kind of measure, and the
measure of time.
typography,
Yeah, that's right.
typography and all that. And that's somehow consistent. It's very explicit in Milton Keynes, but it sort of runs through the book
Yeah.
as this kind of way in which the city communicates.
Yeah, that's right.
You know, the lights outside pubs, the
Yeah,
overside
yeah.
lights outside pubs, probably in a city that didn't have uniformly distributed street lighting.
Yeah.
So there was this idea of provision
Yeah,
to the public realm.
and it's very interesting the way all these things come together. So the light was, as you say, an illumination of, you know, this is the place where, you know, you can get some comfort, and a kind of the pub was an incredibly luxurious interior for the working class who probably lived in, you know, slum accommodation to some extent. But also it's a sign, you know, this is a pub. You know, for people that can't read, and 50% of the population are probably illiterate. So it's interesting how all these things, the kind of commerce and the public, the sort of the public and the private, the commercial and the cultural, all kind of converge in pieces of relatively
And also,
straightforward.
I'm not sure how rigorously this could be tested, but I heard it said that apparently, you know, corners of Victorian streets were pubs or banks,
Right,
or pawnbrokers,
right,
which also had their own signs. So
Yeah.
there was this sort of way of,
right.
it's a sort of
Navigating.
latent urban
Yeah.
design. It's
Yeah.
not kind of French urban design or Milton
Yeah.
Keynesian, but it's a certain way of distributing things.
Interesting.
On corners, we do
Yeah,
these kind of public events, banks,
Yeah.
pawnbrokers, and pubs,
yeah.
which are obviously deeply related to one
Yeah,
another.
that's right.
But then, and then all the other stuff somehow then kind of
Yeah.
infills,
It's very interesting. Yeah.
infills these things. I suppose that then kind of leads on a little bit to one thing that the book made me think of is what does our culture produce now?
Right.
How many of the things in here? I mean, at the back of the book, I should say that there is a sort of photo essay, almost in that ways of seeing
Yeah.
tradition, where
Right.
in ways of seeing, there's one of the chapters that has
Yeah.
no words
Yeah.
and it's just a series of pictures. There's a series of your own photographs. You can see here, this is kind of informal array of things that you've noticed, which is probably the nearest the book gets to a kind of contemporary survey,
Yeah.
but it's not contemporary design.
No.
It's the way you find stuff.
Yeah.
What about contemporary design in the city?
Yeah, well, it's pretty depressing. I mean, you talked about the melancholy, and there isn't much to enjoy. I mean, when I was writing the book, there was this interesting moment where there was one of these panics, kind of public panics about 5G masts being
Yeah.
installed. People were setting fire to 5G masts because they thought they were transmitting coronavirus, and there were these mad kind of conspiracy theories. And then street furniture became weirdly the locus of these conspiracies. But in a way, the 5G mast, you know, is such a dull thing. You know, this extruded pole with a kind of fitting on top, very blank fitting on top. It says nothing about our culture, and yet our culture is entirely reliant on the communication that these things are giving us. And you would expect, even with the advances of modernism suggests to us that actually things should be stripped down and elegant. And these things are not that either. They're not stripped down and elegant, and they're not ornate. And they have really nothing to say. You notice it in these kind of communications boxes you see everywhere, these sort of pressed metal, very blank boxes which contain all the, you know, the junctions and the switches and the underpinning of the telecom system. They have nothing really to express about our culture. And I suppose in a way that was one of the triggers for writing the book, is to ask that question, not to answer it, but to ask, you know, why haven't we got more confidence in making these things interesting, more beautiful? And maybe they don't need to be beautiful necessarily, but it would be,
Yeah,
it would be good if there was some intent,
Yes.
And if they're very simple, then at least if you know, it would be interesting to know why they look simple. What is that? It'd be interesting to know that someone has thought about the visual impact of these things on the streets, and they do have an impact. So I think that's part of the you know.
I mean,
sadness.
I get really sort of saddened or depressed by water. So fountains, and I don't know if it was this summer or last summer. It was very hot.
Yeah.
And I became interested. Yeah, I had my little chili
Yeah.
bottle.
Yeah.
As everybody does now, and I became interested. Like, where can I refill it?
Yeah.
And okay, you can get it in coffee shops and all of that. And then I found that there are like fountains, drinking water fountains. There are some in London, but so few.
Yeah.
I mean, so few.
Yeah.
And the ones that I did find, there's one outside Tate Modern.
Right.
There's one near the Millennium Wheel, the London Eye.
Yeah.
Just kind of inboard a little bit. And it's basically a pole with a kind of slightly grubby button
Yeah.
that you can put your bottle under, installed right next to a bin. And the whole thing has so little dignity about it, and it almost makes you feel like the water isn't drinkable.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then there are, you know, there's a couple of others, but generally as artifacts, I would be very surprised if one day in the future anybody writes a book about them.
Yeah.
Or
Well, I mean, there is one quite close to here, not Red Lion Square, but there's a little square a few blocks from here where they have one of these new things installed, and it's a white plastic tube with a kind of blue cartoonish drop on top of it. And it looks really appalling. I mean, it looks absolutely dreadful. It would look bad in a shop display from 1986. It would look out of fashion. And it is incredible that the city is full of these Victorian fountains, which are the most amazing things. I mean, absolutely granite, and they tend to have troughs nearby so the animals could be watered as well. And there's a sense that this is a real public utility, you know. And okay, now we've all got running fresh water, so that those things are not they don't have the same importance they once did. But now, as you say, that we're all running around with refillable bottles, suddenly they do have importance, and there just isn't a kind of commensurate care.
Yeah, I think that would be what I would probably, in a sense, draw from the book, but maybe also because I think we might be running out of time a little bit. Maybe the kind of the thing that the book is most enriching by is the level of care in which things were done in the city over and beyond their pure function.
Yeah.
The way that things were done in such a way that they would somehow communicate and elevate and kind of bring a kind of dignity to the city through extremely functional objects. And that is something which is absolutely absent today. And it's kind of saddening that you got junctions with crowd control, surveillance, comms, and nobody seems to give a shit.
No, that's right.
Even in places where you know, planners will be kind of utterly dogmatic about context and being contextual in architecture. Yet they will allow this stuff to just be accumulated kind of so I hope that maybe this book will be both the designers, but maybe it will slip out of the architecture community and go into, I don't know, local authorities, infiltrate, and then become something that people start looking at. Because even in the cover image, maybe we just end with something you could just tell us about the cover image, which is just a fantastic.
Well, it's a shot by Helen Levitt from the mid 80s. It looks actually older. It looks like it should be from the 60s. But I've got to say that it wasn't my choice. I wanted to put a Curtis, Andre Curtis, a very kind of classic Parisian photo on the front, and my designer, the publisher, said no, this is better, and she was absolutely right. I mean, it's an image so full of life. It's this, you know, large woman with her two kids stuffed next to her in a phone box. And it just kind of says everything about the city in a way, about the kind of the crowdedness of the city, the intimacy, the kind of capacity for communication, and the fascination with the small space. You know, the way the kids are crowded in there. You know, there's something I think about street furniture is because it's small, it condenses a lot of information and memory and meaning and so on. And I think that's just such a great encapsulation of that.
That seems like the perfect place to end.
Great.
Great.
Thanks, Tom. Thanks so much.
Thanks,
Great talking to
Eddie.
you.
Thanks, Architecture Foundation. Do read this book. It's just really fantastic and full of treasures.
Thank you. Thanks. That's great. Thank you, Paul.